Three tiny kids show up at a tough rancher's door, holding a secret that shakes him up like nothing else in 20 years. And just like that, his whole world starts to crack. Three small figures stood at the edge of Malachi Brooks's property, clutching. Something that made the feared rancher's hand shake for the first time in 20 years. The triplets couldn't have been more than 8 years old. Their clothes worn thin from travel, their eyes holding the kind of desperation that comes from having nowhere else to turn. But it wasn't their condition that stopped Malachi cold in. His tracks. It was the carved bone pendant the smallest one held, identical to the one he'd buried along with his past. Malachi Brooks was known throughout the territory as a man who crushed anyone who crossed him, who built his empire on the bones of those too weak to survive. That was the rule everyone understood. But when the middle child stepped forward and spoke a single word in a language Malachi thought he'd forgotten, everything he'd built his life on cracked like glass. The word meant brother in a tongue he hadn't heard since the night he'd sworn never to be that person again. And somehow these three children knew exactly who he used to be. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty ground as Malachi forced his trembling hands into fists. His ranch hands had stopped their work, sensing something was wrong with their usually unshakable boss. The tallest of the three boys, no more than a whisper of wind in his thin frame, took another step forward. His dark eyes held no fear, only a desperate determination that reminded Malachi of someone he'd tried so hard to forget. The child's lips moved again, this time forming words in broken English mixed with that ancient language that cut through Malachi like a blade through paper. The boy spoke of a woman named Elena, of a promise made under starlight, of 3 children who had walked for 7 days to find the only man who could save them. Each word hit Malachi like a physical blow, dragging him back to memories he'd buried deeper than any grave. His mind raced back to a night 20 years ago when he'd stood in a similar clearing, making promises to a woman with eyes like midnight and a voice that could calm the wildest storm. Elena Crow had been more than just another person in his forgotten life. She had been the reason he'd chosen to disappear, to become someone else entirely. The pendant the child held wasn't just similar to his own. It was the exact twin carved, from the same bone, blessed in the same ceremony, given as a symbol of protection that he'd believed was lost forever. But if these children carried Elena's pendant, if they knew the old words, if they'd found him across all these years and miles, then something had gone terribly wrong, something that would force him to confront the man he used to be, the promises he'd broken, and the life he'd abandoned. The smallest boy suddenly collapsed to his knees, his breathing shallow and labored. And Malachi realized that whatever had brought these children to his door wasn't just about the past. It was about life and death. The child's collapse shattered Malachi's hesitation like a gunshot through glass. 20 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled in an instant as he dropped to his knees beside the boy, his weathered hands hovering over the small frame. The other 2 brothers pressed closer, their eyes wide with terror that spoke of too many losses already endured. Up close, Malachi could see the hollowness in their cheeks, the way their clothes hung loose on bodies that had known too little food for too long. But it was their faces that nearly broke him. The same sharp cheekbones, the same determined set of the jaw that he remembered from looking into Elena's eyes all those years ago. These weren't just any children seeking help. They were Elena's children. His throat tightened as he lifted the smallest boy into his arms, feeling how light he was, how fragile. The child's breathing was shallow but steady, and when his eyes fluttered open, they focused on Malachi with a recognition that shouldn't have been possible. The middle child, who had spoken the word that changed everything, reached into a worn leather pouch at his side and pulled out a folded piece of cloth. With trembling fingers, he unwrapped it to reveal a small sketch drawn in charcoal on bark. The image was rough but unmistakable. a younger version of Malachi, but not the Malachi Brooks who owned half the territory. This was someone else entirely, someone with longer hair and different clothes, someone who belonged to a world he'd tried to erase. Below the drawing in Elena's careful script were words that made his blood run cold. Find him. He will remember his promise. The oldest brother finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper, but his words carried the weight of a journey that had cost them everything. He told of how their mother had grown sick, how the medicine man couldn't help her, how she'd made them promise to find the man in the drawing before it was too late. They'd walked for days without proper food, following stories and rumors until someone in the last town had pointed them toward the Brooks Ranch. Malachi's ranch hands were gathering at a respectful distance, their confusion evident as they watched their hard-edged boss cradle a child with a gentleness they'd never seen before. He could feel their stares, could sense the questions forming, but all of that seemed distant compared to the reality crashing down around him. Elena was dying. These were her children, children who carried his blood, though they might never know it. The promise he'd made under the stars wasn't just about love or loyalty. It was about responsibility he'd run from, about a life he'd abandoned for reasons that now seemed hollow and selfish. But as he looked at the three boys, as he felt the weight of their need and the echo of old vows, he realized that some debts could never be outrun. The question wasn't whether he would help them. The question was whether helping them would destroy everything he'd built and everyone who depended on him. Malachi stood with the unconscious child still in his arms, his mind racing through possibilities and consequences like a man calculating the cost of his own destruction. His foreman, Carter, approached with the cautious steps of someone who'd learned to read his boss's dangerous moods. The other ranch hands hung back, sensing the electricity in the air that preceded Malachi's most ruthless decisions. But this time, something was different. This time the calculation wasn't about profit or power. It was about a debt that had been accumulating interest for 20 years. Without explanation, Malachi turned toward the main house, carrying the boy, while the other two followed like shadows at his heels. Carter called after him, confusion evident in his voice, asking about the work schedule, about the cattle buyers coming tomorrow, about the 100 details that kept the ranch profitable. Malachi ignored every word, his focus entirely on the weight of the child in his arms and the weight of the choice he was about to make. Inside the house, Malachi laid the boy on the couch in his private study, the same room where he conducted the business that had made him one of the most feared men in the territory. The irony wasn't lost on him, bringing these echoes of his past into the heart of his present. The middle child, who seemed to carry the weight of leadership despite his young years, carefully placed the charcoal drawing on Malachi's massive oak desk. Up close, the resemblance was even more striking, not just to his younger self, but to features he recognized in the boys' faces. Elena had been careful with her secrets. But genetics didn't lie. These weren't just children she was sending to him for help. They were his children, carrying his blood and her strength, raised in a world he'd abandoned for the promise of easier wealth. The oldest boy finally found his voice again, speaking slowly in careful English about their journey. They'd left their village when their mother collapsed, following the only clue she'd given them about the man who could save her life. The sound of approaching horses broke through Malachi's concentration like thunder across a clear sky. Through the window he could see riders approaching fast, their dust trails speaking of urgency that matched the chaos already unfolding in his carefully ordered world. Carter burst through the door without knocking, his face flushed with alarm. The visitors weren't cattle buyers or business associates, they were tribal representatives, and they were armed. Elena hadn't just sent her children to find him, she'd sent them ahead of a war party that was coming to collect on promises he'd thought were buried forever. The middle child looked up at Malachi with eyes too old for his face and spoke words that chilled him to the bone. Elena hadn't just fallen ill, she'd been poisoned. Someone had discovered her connection to the man who'd become Malachi Brooks, and they were using her as bait to draw him out of hiding. The riders outside weren't coming to negotiate. They were coming to drag him back to face justice for crimes he'd committed in another life under another name. The war party stopped just outside rifle range, their horses stamping and snorting in the afternoon heat, while their riders sat with the patience of men who had traveled far for a specific purpose. Malachi counted 8 warriors, their faces painted for battle, their weapons visible but not yet drawn. At their head sat a man he recognized even after 20 years, Stone Bear, Elena's brother, the same man who had sworn to kill him if he ever saw him again. The promise Malachi had broken wasn't just about love. It was about honor, about responsibility, about a betrayal that had cost lives and shattered trust between peoples who had once called each other allies. His ranch hands were reaching for their weapons, looking to him for orders. But Malachi raised his hand for them to hold their positions. Any violence now would doom Elena and destroy any chance these children had of survival. The oldest boy tugged at Malachi's sleeve and whispered, words that hit him like a physical blow. Stone Bear wasn't just Elena's brother. He was the father of the man Malachi had killed. The memories came flooding back like a dam bursting under pressure. 20 years ago, he hadn't been Malachi Brooks, successful rancher and ruthless businessman. He'd been someone else entirely, a trader and negotiator who'd worked between the white settlements and the tribal territories, building trust and prosperity for both sides. But greed had corrupted him. Greed and the promise of wealth that seemed easier than the slow work of honest dealing. He'd betrayed information about a planned peace gathering, information that had led to an ambush where Stone Bear's son and 6 other young warriors had died. Elena had loved him despite knowing what he'd done, had even helped him escape when Stone Bear's vengeance came calling. But she'd made him promise that if she ever needed him, if her life, or the lives of her children were ever in danger, he would return to face whatever consequences awaited him. The poisoning wasn't random. Someone had discovered Elena's connection to the man who'd become Malachi Brooks and was using her as bait to draw him into the open. Carter appeared at his shoulder, rifle in hand, reporting that the ranch hands were positioned and ready for whatever came next. But Malachi wasn't calculating odds or planning strategy. He was staring at the 3 boys who carried his blood, who had traveled through danger to reach him, who represented everything he'd gained and everything he'd lost when he'd chosen to become someone else. Stone Bear raised his hand and called, out across the distance, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. He spoke Elena's name, then the name Malachi used to answer to, then words in the old language that roughly translated to a simple choice. Come forward and face judgment, or watch the children pay the price for his cowardice. The smallest boy had awakened and was looking up at Malachi with fever-bright eyes, asking in a whisper if the bad men were going to hurt them. Malachi realized that 20 years of running had led him to this moment, this choice between the life he'd built and the people who needed him to remember who he used to be. Malachi handed his rifle to Carter and walked toward the door, each step feeling like a march toward his own execution. The 3 boys watched him with eyes that held too much understanding for their age, and the oldest one grabbed his arm with a grip surprisingly strong for such a small hand. In halting English mixed with words from the old language, the boy told him something that changed everything. Elena wasn't dying from poison. She was dying because she'd refused to reveal where Malachi was hiding, and her captors were slowly killing her to force the information from her lips. The distinction hit Malachi like a physical blow. This wasn't about drawing him into a trap. This was about Elena protecting him, even as it cost her everything. Stone Bear's war party wasn't here as Elena's enemy. They were here as her rescue mission, and they needed him to save the woman who'd sacrificed herself to keep his location secret. The middle child pulled out another piece of bark with Elena's writing, this one more recent. the charcoal letters, shaky with weakness, but clear in their message. She'd sent the children away, not to find help for her illness, but to warn Malachi that danger was coming and to beg him to disappear again before it was too late. But as Malachi stepped onto his front porch, hands raised to show he carried no weapons, the scene before him exploded into chaos that no one had anticipated. A third group of riders thundered into view from the eastern trail, their horses lathered, with sweat and their faces grim with purpose. These weren't tribal warriors or ranch hands. They were territorial marshals, led by a man whose presence made Malachi's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Marshal Davis had been hunting the man Malachi used to be for 2 decades, following a trail of broken treaties and stolen gold that had grown cold until someone had recently provided new information. The war party wheeled their horses to face this new threat, and suddenly the confrontation wasn't about justice or family honor. It was about survival. Davis called out across the distance, his voice carrying the authority of federal law and the promise of a noose. He wasn't here to negotiate or arrest. He was here to collect the bounty on a man whose crimes had grown larger in legend than they'd ever been in reality. Stone Bear looked from the marshals to Malachi, his weathered face showing the rapid calculation of a warrior who'd walked into a situation far more complicated than anyone had expected. The children inside the house represented innocent lives. That would be destroyed if violence erupted, but running now would abandon Elena to whatever fate awaited her at the hands of her captors. Carter and the ranch hands were outnumbered and outgunned, caught between federal authorities and tribal warriors who'd both arrived seeking the same man for entirely different reasons. Malachi realized that the choice he'd thought he was facing between his old life and his new one was actually far more complex. Someone had orchestrated this convergence, someone who wanted to see him destroyed completely. And as the 3 groups faced each other in the growing afternoon heat, with Elena's children hiding inside and her life hanging in the balance, Malachi understood that the only way out was through a truth he'd been hiding even from himself. The standoff stretched like a wire about to snap when a 4th rider appeared on the horizon, moving at a pace that suggested either desperation or absolute confidence. As the figure drew closer, Malachi felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Elena sat astride a paint horse, her body swaying with weakness, but her eyes blazing with the same fierce determination he remembered from 20 years ago. She wasn't dying in captivity. She was here, alive, and the look she gave him carried both love and accusation in equal measure. Behind her rode a man Malachi recognized with a shock that nearly dropped him to his knees. Carter, his trusted foreman, the man who'd worked beside him for 15 years, building the ranch and earning his complete trust. But the Carter riding behind Elena wasn't the loyal employee he thought he knew. This Carter held a rifle trained on her back and wore the satisfied expression of a man whose long-planned revenge was finally coming to fruition. The pieces fell into place with brutal clarity. Carter had been the one feeding information to Marshal Davis. Carter had been the one who discovered Elena's location and used her to draw everyone into this deadly convergence. Elena's voice carried across the distance as she called out words that shattered the last of Malachi's illusions about his carefully constructed life. Carter wasn't just a vengeful employee. He was the brother of the territorial governor's son, the young man who died in the ambush that Malachi had made possible 20 years ago. For 15 years, Carter had worked beside him, learned his habits, earned his trust, all while planning this moment when he could destroy not just Malachi, but everyone he'd ever cared about. The marshal's presence wasn't coincidence. It was coordination. Stone Bear's war party wasn't here for justice. They'd been manipulated into coming here as witnesses to what Carter planned to frame as a massacre. Elena's poisoning had been real, but it hadn't been about forcing information from her. It had been about weakening her enough that she couldn't interfere with Carter's final gambit. The 3 children inside the house weren't just Malachi's sons. They were the leverage Carter needed to make him choose between saving them and saving Elena. Stone Bear seemed to understand the situation with the quick intelligence of a seasoned warrior, and his hand moved to his weapon as he recognized the threat that Carter represented to all of them. But Carter had planned for this, too, and his next words carried across the space between them like the promise of doom. He'd planted explosives in the main house, timed to detonate if he didn't return within the hour. The children were trapped inside what had become their own tomb. Elena was slowly bleeding from wounds hidden beneath her clothing, and the marshal was under orders to shoot anyone who moved aggressively toward his supposed ally. Malachi realized that Carter's revenge wasn't just about killing him. It was about making him watch everyone he'd ever loved die first, then living with that guilt for whatever brief time remained to him. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as 4 groups of people who'd arrived for different reasons found themselves united in a common danger. With time running out and death approaching from multiple directions at once, Malachi looked at Elena, bleeding in her saddle, at Stone Bear, calculating odds with a warrior's precision. At Marshal Davis beginning. To understand, he'd been played for a fool and felt something shift inside him like a key turning in a lock that had been sealed for 20 years. The man he'd been trying to bury wasn't his weakness. It was the only strength that could save everyone he loved. Without warning, he threw himself sideways as Carter's rifle swung toward him, the shot going wide as Malachi rolled behind the water trough. Stone Bear moved at the same instant, his warriors spreading in a coordinated pattern that spoke of battles fought and won together. Marshal Davis, realizing he'd been used as a pawn in Carter's game of revenge, turned his weapon toward the real criminal. Carter's carefully laid plan began unraveling as the 3 groups he'd hoped to turn against each other instead recognized their common enemy. But Carter had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and he wasn't finished yet. From his saddlebags, he pulled a device that made everyone freeze. The detonator for the explosives in the house, where 3 innocent children waited in terror. Elena slid from her horse with the last of her strength, her hand finding the rifle she'd hidden beneath her skirts. 20 years of separation hadn't dimmed. Her marksmanship and her shot took Carter's horse down, sending him tumbling to the ground, but not releasing his grip on the detonator. Stone Bear's warriors surrounded the fallen man, while Marshal Davis kept his weapon trained on Carter's chest. But no one dared move closer while those children's lives hung by the thread of Carter's wounded pride. Malachi emerged from cover, with his hands visible, approaching Carter with the slow steps of a man who finally understood what needed to be done. Carter's face was twisted with hatred accumulated over 15 years of pretending loyalty while planning destruction. He spoke of his brother, of the dreams that had died in that ambush, of the justice he'd been denied when Malachi disappeared into his new identity. But his words carried the hollow ring of a man who'd let revenge consume everything good in his life, who'd become more monster than the man he was hunting. The standoff stretched until the smallest of Elena's children appeared in the doorway of the house, his fever-bright eyes looking for the man who'd promised to protect them. Carter's finger tightened on the detonator, but in that moment of distraction, Elena found the strength for one final act of love. She lunged forward, her wounded body, colliding with Carter's arm just as Stone Bear's throwing knife found its mark in Carter's wrist. The detonator flew from nerveless fingers, landing in the dust where Marshal Davis crushed it under his boot heel. Carter's scream of rage and pain echoed across the ranch as 15 years of planning died in the space of a heartbeat. But as the immediate danger passed, Malachi realized the hardest part was yet to come. Facing the consequences of his past actions and deciding who he would choose to be for whatever time remained to him, Carter lay in the dust with Stone Bear's knife buried in his wrist and his 15-year plan shattered around him like broken glass. Marshal Davis bound the wound with professional efficiency while reading charges that would see Carter hang for conspiracy, attempted murder, and fraud against a federal officer. The explosives in the house had been a bluff, Carter's final lie. in a life built on deception. But the danger he'd represented was real enough to earn him a rope. As the marshal prepared to take his prisoner away, Carter looked up at Malachi with eyes full of the hatred that had consumed him, speaking words that carried the bitter taste of defeat. He'd wanted to destroy Malachi's new life, but instead, he'd only succeeded in forcing him to reclaim his old one. Elena struggled to her feet with Stonebear's help, her wounds painful but not fatal, her eyes finding Malachi across the space that had separated them for 20 years. The children emerged from the house like birds released from a cage, running to their mother and to the man they now understood was their father. Stonebear approached Malachi with the measured steps of a warrior who'd found something he hadn't expected to find. Not the coward who'd run from justice, but a man who'd stood his ground when it mattered most. The debt between them wasn't settled by one act of courage. But Stonebear had seen enough to know that the man before him wasn't the same person who'd betrayed his people 20 years ago. They spoke in the old language, words of acknowledgement and acceptance that didn't erase the past, but allowed for a different kind of future. The promise Malachi had made to Elena under starlight wasn't just about returning when she needed him. It was about being the man she'd believed he could become, even when he'd stopped believing it himself. Marshal Davis departed with his prisoner, the territorial government's interest in Malachi Brooks ending with Carter's arrest and confession. The ranch hands who'd witnessed the confrontation would spread the story across the territory, but it would be a story of a man who'd faced his past and chosen to protect the innocent rather than preserve his own comfort. Elena took Malachi's hand as their 3 sons explored the ranch that would become their home, her touch carrying the weight of forgiveness and the promise of healing that would take time but was finally possible. The man who'd called himself Malachi Brooks for 20 years was gone. Not destroyed, but transformed into someone who could carry both his past mistakes and his present responsibilities without being crushed by either. Stonebear and his warriors departed with the understanding that old wounds could heal and old enemies could become allies. When honor was restored and promises were kept, the ranch would continue to prosper, but under a different kind of management, one that honored both the land and the people who'd originally called it home. As the sun set over the territory that had been the stage for so much conflict and resolution, Elena and her children began the work of building a life with a man who'd finally learned that running from the past was less important than running toward the future. The carved bone pendant that had started everything hung around the neck of the smallest boy. No longer a reminder of separation, but a symbol of family reunited and promises finally kept. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to